The whole idea here is to focus on intelligence operations. And if you take a look at most people who not only study counterterrorism, but people who are active in the field, people who work in our intelligence agencies and also in the military, they'll tell you that, you have all the fancy stuff. We have, you've got drones, you've got various kinds of tactics and things, but at the heart of everything is intelligence. And this Syracuse model very much came up as part of that package, which I call intelligence operations research. And intelligence operations research is a nice phrase. It gives us a little play on words. You can think of intelligence operations research as having two different meanings. The first is intelligence operations research, meaning studies about how to actually improve intelligence operations, the same way other people might be interested in improving service operations or manufacturing operations or public health operations or whatever you want. Intelligence is a process that produces a product, and that's something I think people don't really get. You think of intelligence as just sort of knowing stuff, but it's actually much more complicated than that, and it's much more systematic than that. There are products at the end of the day that are delivered to the various intelligence customers, be they politicians, be they people in the military, or so forth. So how can you make the whole intelligence operations process more efficient and more effective? So that's the first part. The second play on words is intelligence operations research, which means we take tools from operations research into management sciences and we apply it to problems in intelligence. And so what we're going to do today is an illustration of the second meaning of the term. We're going to use queuing theory in a terrorism context. Here's a study of foiled and executed plots in the US, 1999 to 2009. Now, when I say executed, I'm using the definition I gave you before, avoiding intelligence until the last second. So the Times Square bomber would count as an executed plot, as would Kaplan Underpants, the guy who tried to blow up the plane. And now we've got a mix of domestic and international plots here. We've got jihadi plots, but we also have white supremacists. We also have some of the animal rights activists, people who are blowing up laboratories because of testing cosmetics on rabbits and stuff like that. All right, let's focus on jihadi terror plots. That seems to be what scares everybody. And this book, The Al-Qaeda Factor by Mitch Sober, is of note. Mitch Sober has just stepped down as the head of intelligence for NYPD. So he's the guy who's kind of been at the heart of virtually all the plots you've been reading about in the New York Times. What this book does, by the way, is it gives you a series of case studies on these plots which have been caught. And so what's interesting here is he says, look, you take a look at these operations, and it turns out that most of them have not been directed from above. Most of them have been manned by volunteers who joined from the bottom up. And Al-Qaeda Corps' role in plots is in general decline. That seems a big finding coming out of this work. And the folks at NYPD went further than this. They actually tried to characterize what's going on with these so-called lone wolf plots, which have been happening in the United States. And actually, this looks a little bit like epidemiology in terms of sort of like the progression of an infection or something. He identifies these 4 different stages and has various indicators for them. The last stage, jihadization, I'm pretty sure that's not a real word, but anyway, stage 4, what I'm interested in are the real plots. I'm interested in this. I'm interested in people who have actually gone to the point where they've said, I'm going to conduct an attack, I know what my target's going to be, I've got my weapons. These are the folks where you sort of get to that stage and something's going to happen if you don't stop it. What Silber and Bopp did was they actually tried to estimate for a number of plots that they were familiar with how much time these different phases took. And again, my interest is really in this last step, what they call jihadization. This is the step during which a plot is actually being planned. So if I'm defining plots that are in that stage as real undetected plots, already that should tell you that the number out there, at least in the United States, is probably not that big. And one reason for saying that is that the durations here are not that long. So that motivated a search to try and be a little bit more specific about it. The folks at NYU have done us a huge favor. The Center for Law and Security at the New York University School of Law has a series of publicly available reports called the Terrorist Trial Report Card. And what these are doing is they are tracking and analyzing every federal prosecution that the Justice Department claims is terror-related. So they've gone out, they've searched all the databases to try and figure out just what's going on with terrorism, at least as it's reached the criminal justice system. And they discover over 1,000 prosecutions. This is from 9/11 until, actually, the data that I'm using go through June of last year, not all the way up to September. But 1,554 prosecutions and 846 different defendants. So of course, some people can be charged with multiple offenses, which is what's going on here, organized by date of indictment. This is a great database to start with. So now the question is, do I really believe then that over time there were 846 terror plots or something approaching that? Well, it turns out, as I said, I want to focus on jihadi plots. About 55% of the cases in these data are jihadi. And what do I mean by jihadi? Let's just take their definition directly. It's going to include anyone who was formally or informally associated with a terror group, whether it was global, like Al-Qaeda, or local, like Hamas. But it also includes defendants who are unaffiliated with a terror group, but who are inspired by Al-Qaeda or Hamas or Hezbollah or something like this. In other words, this is a pretty broad definition of what it means to be jihadi. But even with this broad definition, we throw out 45% of the cases. We're down to 55%. But remember, I want to focus on people who are actually engaged in real plots. And it turns out that the overwhelming majority of these don't link to specific terror plots targeting the United States. In fact, a lot of them don't link to terror plots at all. Most of these things are cases of what's called material support. It could be that they're raising money, which is then going to be shipped overseas, say, to another group. So the same Mitch Silber, who I mentioned a few slides ago, got on board with me on this project and basically went through this entire list. And it's good to have somebody on the inside tell you what's a plot, what's not a plot. Because if you just read the newspapers, you'll discover things which look really serious, but he'll say, you know, these were two kids with binoculars in Atlanta. They were playing a game, let's play jihadi. There was nothing in further investigation which linked them to anything real. They had no idea what was feasible. They had no source of weaponry. They had nothing. That was, by the way, called the Atlanta casing plot. That shows up in some other terrorism databases as a real plot. I cross-checked this with that earlier report from the Homeland Security Institute that I showed you before. And then, of course, there are going to be a couple of cases outside the legal system. For example, there was an attack in Los Angeles at the El Al ticket counter, some of you might remember. That case never went to prosecution because the guy who was the shooter in the attack was himself shot by a security guard as part of that. He killed a few people first. So not everything is in here, but the sample does include everything you've heard about. The shoe bomber, Captain Underpants, Herald Square subway bomb, JFK fuel tanks, Times Square bomb, LAX shootings, and so forth. So all the main terror plots that you can think of in the United States over the last 10 years are in the database. But it also excludes a lot of things that you might also have heard of. The Lackawanna 7, this Oregon camp, the so-called paintball network. These were things which, in the judgment of Mitch and his colleagues, didn't really qualify as serious plots. Okay. So I've got now a database. It's basically 35 plots. And what I want to do is ask how much time passes from when the plot starts until when the plot ends. And it ends when, again, either it's detected or there's actually an attack. So as I said, it's hard to know when a plot begins, right? You can't really tell. And so picking a date and saying that's magically the start date, I think is probably not fruitful. But it's not a bad idea to figure out upper and lower bounds on the starting time. So what do I mean? I'm going to define two terms, early start and late start. Early start, plot had not yet begun before this date. And the late start, the plot had certainly begun after that date, as of that date. In between, the plot sort of started, but we don't know exactly when. We just know that it's in between those two times. And how do I estimate these dates? Well, this is the lion's share of person time in the project. It's going back over indictments, criminal complaints, unsealed documents, including testimonies from the undercover agents and so forth, to try and figure out what went on in each of these cases. We get these early and late start dates for 30 out of the 35 plots. For 5 of them, there's nothing I can do, like the guy at LAX, for example. There's no background information. Nobody knew who he was. He's shot. You can't work backwards. There were some other cases where people were caught outside of the country, and it's just very, very hard to dig into it. I'm sure, by the way, that people with better clearances would be able to go in and get more information on some of these. But from those data, you can actually estimate this duration distribution, and you do this statistically. And again, I'm going to leave the details of how to do that out, but for those of you who are interested in sort of the statistical estimation details, that's all contained in the paper that I'll stick up on the website. But this is what comes out. You actually get an estimate of what the duration distribution is for these plots from the time they began until they were either interdicted or executed. And I've got 2 different models up here. The blue line is a parametric model. It assumes a certain probability distribution. These black steps here is what's called a nonparametric estimate. For those of you in statistics, it's very similar to a Kaplan-Meier curve idea, except it's more complicated because we have the uncertainty into starting times. But what you end up from both models is that the average is about 270 days, which would be 9 months. And a 95% probability interval for these things would be 1 to 25 months. 9/11 would be at the upper tail of this distribution. These other plots, none of them were potentially as serious as 9/11, although some of them, of course, could have had considerable loss of life, namely the shoe bomber and the underwear bomber, things which would have brought airplanes down, would have killed a lot of people. Now we come back to the question, how many terror plots? So, again, we've got our key equation here. And we plug in the estimates for the mean duration, which was 270 days. And we have this arrival rate, 35 plots over a little less than 10 years. You plug it in and you get 2.6, or about 3. Maybe the guy with the girlfriends was right. Okay. Now, is there any way to look at this to see if it's internally consistent with itself? And it turns out that there is a way to do it, because this sort of is relying on this distribution that I fit and estimate. Maybe that model wasn't quite right. So let's go back to the idea of just looking at the early start, the late start, and the completion times. Let's let P of t be the probability that any point in time t a plot is actually in play. All right, it looks like this. It looks like this little piece of cheese. Between the early start and the late start, the probability just grows as a straight line, because the assumption is that it's equally likely that it started anywhere between those times. And then up until the completion time, the plot is in play, and then once it's caught, it drops off. Notice that if we knew exactly when the starting date was, we would have basically something that looks like this. The plot would start, the plot would end. It would be either in play or not in play. So this is like that. Okay, so now what we do is we can make a picture like this for every one of the plots, at least for the 30 for which I have the information. And now, over time, if I want to know on average how many plots were in play at any point in time, I just add these things up, right? I just add the probability that a plot was active, and that's going to tell me how many there were. And so when we do that, we get this, which is kind of interesting. It goes up, it goes down. One thing about this process, if you were going to say, is there some kind of time trend in here? Does this look like there's anything going on, strategic or whatever? This is completely consistent with a Poisson process, folks. This is completely consistent with a random process. And you can say, well, but I thought terrorism was strategic, except think back to what Silber said. Most of these plots are not command and control plots being generated by some, honcho up at the top of Al-Qaeda. These are people who are sort of self-initiating things on their own. They're working independently. And that sort of would lead you to expect a random process, and that's what you get. Now, the other thing which is interesting that you can do with these data is you can say, well, wait a minute. Now that I realize this picture that I put together, what would I have expected this picture to look like if I believe my duration model, if I believe the curve I estimated before about the durations? And again, the details are in the paper, but basically you would expect to see this red line. The reason why it dies at the end here, because I've collected data up until June 30th of 2011. By the time I get to that date, I'm out. There's nothing left because I'm done with the data. So this is basically what would I be able to see in the data. And what's interesting is that this kind of picks this thing up at the end almost perfectly, but there's no curve fitting here. It's not like you have these data, you propose a curve that looks like this and say, how can I match it? All right. All right. So all told, estimate about 3 jihadi plots in progress in the United States. The way to interpret this is between 9/11 and the middle of June last year. At any point in time, how many plots are in progress? My answer would be a mean of 3. All right, people say it's got to be more than that. How could we possibly be spending all this money on it? All right, so an upper 95% confidence interval for the mean pushes us up to 4. All right, but that's just still an average. There's Poisson noise around there, right? Okay, so an upper Poisson confidence interval about that pushes us up to 7. That's about as big as I can make it. All right, it's not hundreds, it's not thousands, it's not tens of thousands, it's 3. Which brings us to the close here, because there's 2 ways to look at this. Here's one interpretation. You know, we got so many, we're spending so much money on Homeland Security and counterterrorism when there's so few terror plots in play. You know, we've got education, we've got public health, we've got job creation. Why are we doing all this? That's one interpretation. The other interpretation, you can guess. Who wants to say it? Yeah? Right. It's precisely because of the investments that you only have 3. And that if you were to pull it all back, you would have more than 3. You know, how many airplane crashes do we have each year? Not too many, right? We don't have a lot of airplane crashes. You agree? How much money do we spend to make sure we don't have airplane crashes? Lots of money, all right? So it's that sort of thing. Now, the thing about airline safety is you can see right away that there would be a disaster if we didn't do anything about it, because we can see how many airplanes are taking off every day, right? Every one of which is a potential crash. We can't see how many terror plots would be taking off every day. On the basis of what I've done, it's not really possible to tell the difference between these 2 things. But on the other hand, it's a starting point. So that's sort of where I'll leave you.